All right, in this video, I'm going to discuss the ways I like to use what I imagine is the most widely adopted post-flop solver. PO solver is, it's also been around the longest, the widest used commercially available solver. And I think that the functionality remains among the best, or maybe the best, at what it's designed to do. But I do find that a lot of people don't necessarily take advantage of what I think are the strongest features in the program. So I'm going to talk about how I use it personally, why I think it's different from other tools on the market, and how maybe other tools on the market might be more appropriate for certain uses. The primary strengths and I'll say like differentiating feature between a program like PO Solver and a web-based solver, one of those lookup tools that has a lot of pre-solved scenarios. PO Solver is going to be customizable and it's going to be higher accuracy. So I'm sure a lot of you have heard complaints or criticisms of some pre-solved databases that have a really large volume of solutions, but not a particularly high accuracy in the way that they've solved it. So oftentimes I'll have students running into situations where they're confused by the outputs, whether it's because there's too many bet sizes, there's too many options, there's a lot of noise, there's a lot of mixing. And simplifying these down to a strategy they can understand is really valuable. So something you could do is copy the parameters from programs like that into PO Solver for specific scenarios that you're interested in simplifying, or just customizing in any way. You might be looking to add bet sizes, you might be looking to alter bet sizes in some way. But more importantly, you can run them to a higher degree of accuracy to see how that changes the end result. It often makes them simpler, and it, at the very least, will help confirm whether the solution that you were looking at in the first place was valid, or whether it was flawed in some way. Now, the most valuable part, in my opinion, of using PO Solver is the ability to do scripting or aggregated study. And this is, I think, the underutilized part of the program by a lot of, let's say, entry-level users. PO Solver honestly is a bit overkill as a program in how detail-oriented you can design your sims if the only way that you're planning to use it is for individual hands. Very often I recommend for reviewing individual hands to use a different program, something that's faster, something like a lookup tool where you can copy paste your hand history and get a comparable situation. It's a lot more practical to review single hands in that way. Now, a more experienced PO Solver user might find better results by using PO Solver, but to me, really, the power of this program is in the scripting and the aggregate study. So I'm going to show you a little bit of use in the way that I would take advantage of those features. So here you can see the setup page where I've saved a format for heads-up single raised pot scripting. This is one of, I think it's the second most recent version that I've used, and in another video in this course, I'm going to dive more closely into aggregate reports and the work that I did for heads-up no limit game planning, which is going to have the most recent version of these parameters, but these are quite good. And the most important thing here is just that I've been able to build a skeleton structure, so to speak, of the most important flop bet sizes, the most important raise sizes on later streets, the most important river bet sizes, not a massive number of parameters allowed here, but a reasonable number to catch, what you might call small, medium, and large sizing options in all the common situations. So everything from most of my testing, these are some of the most important bet sizes for single raised pots. Adding additional sizes might give you more accuracy in very specific spots, but that's not the goal of aggregate study. for me, the goal of aggregate study, well, it could be multiple things, but in this case, I just want to talk about trying to learn, for example, the overarching strategy of single raised pots, a theoretical approach to learning single raised pots and heads up no limit. And the way that I want to accomplish that is by only offering the most useful bet sizes and not more than that, so that the eventual reports that I get out of this are easy to interpret, they're relatively simple, but at the same time, they accurately replicate all the frequencies and all of the sizing choices, small, medium, or large, that you would see in the most common situations that you need to study. So to set this up, you want to be confident about your preflop ranges. I'll talk about that more in a future video. You want to get the right stack size for the situation that you need the most study in. In this case, it was 100 big blinds. And you want all your bet sizes, as I've described, trimmed down to only the most essential bet sizes. After you've got this framework, you're ready to script across a larger number of flops. So in PO Solver, add to the job queue. This is the 2.0 version. I think it used to say something different. And here you're basically inputting what flops do I want to solve this for. You see that I wrote in here a board of ace, queen, 5, but it doesn't matter what's written here. When you add it to the job queue, it's going to run it across whatever flops you tell it in here. So you could generate random flops, but I wouldn't recommend doing that. I would either enter in my own customized flop subset, or I would load one of the recommended files. PO Solver has a ton of different flop subsets built into the program, and they're all weighted appropriately to represent the frequencies you see across all possible flops. For the purposes of this video, I'll just generate a few so that the file works. You can name it whatever you want. Over here, I've always left that empty. I have no idea what to put in there. And I usually use small saves. What this does is it stores flops and turns. So that means if you want to run a report on flops or on turns using this folder of files, you'll be able to do that. If you want to run rivers, you need full saves, but I will warn you that this uses a ton of storage space and it's much, much slower. So when I'm doing river reports, I would use a much smaller subset. I mean, this is only 5 flops, so that would be fine. But very often I'm doing 200 flops, 500 flops, whatever. For larger subsets like that, I generally do small or even micro saves. I've done some training scripts before, like scripting intended to use with the trainer. I'll talk about that another time. And using the micro saves can be nice for that because it's going to recalculate turns and rivers anyways. So choosing the right size, the algorithm is just going to depend on how much RAM you have, but most likely automatic will work. And generally, I run this to a high but not super high degree of accuracy. I think for single raised pots, running it lower than 1% is going to be pretty time consuming. 0.5 would be a reasonable medium for getting some accuracy, but not taking too long. I think in most cases, even 1% is good for the flop. And then if you run into an issue where you need a more accurate turn or river solution, you can create a subtree within the sim that you're looking at and run it down to a much greater degree of accuracy. But for the whole script, you're just trying to get accurate enough where you can interpret flop data for the most part. And I think that 1% of the pot accuracy across the whole tree is going to be very accurate on the flop already. Once you've got all that set up, you're pretty much ready to go. You can add it to your backlog. This is just some old stuff that I'm sure I've finished running, but I guess on another machine. But you can see it's down here. You would just run it from this interface. And as you add more scripts, you could just add to this backlog and have it continue to run. Very often people will put this on a server and let it run for days or let it run overnight. At the very least, I would set this up in a way where when you close down your session for the evening, you could load up your queue in PO Solver at the end of the night, get it started, run it overnight, and then the next morning you've got 10 hours or 12 hours of work being done on your behalf while you slept. So really nice tool here to take advantage of the strength of this program. Now, I do think it's important we talk about the weaknesses of all of the programs that I'm reviewing. The steep learning curve is honestly the most common roadblock I see my students come to for why they're not using PioSolver more. It's a complicated program to feel comfortable with. To get to the point where you are quickly setting up sims, it's not it's not easy to get past that hurdle unless you're already pretty comfortable with this type of study, unless you have a lot of patience for setting up the parameters. What I would recommend to get past this is, one, to have someone else help you at the beginning. So to find a friend, a study partner, a coach, whoever, who can help you get familiar with the way you personally want to use the program. But another big thing is, as you're going, save a whole lot of setup that you've done on previous sims so that you can preload it for future sims and make those future sims easier for you. So I didn't go through it when I was showing you that report setup, but I've got my preflop ranges saved so that every time I want to do a heads up sim, I can click through an easy folder to load those preflop ranges. I've got my postflop bet sizing saved. So every time I want to do a 3-bet pot, I can just load the last 3-bet pot that I did and make little edits rather than having to set up everything from scratch. So save as much stuff as you can, and that's going to make future sims a lot easier, but it will take some time to get over that initial hurdle for sure. And time consuming, I mean, this is the same sort of complaint. It takes a while to get into the swing of using this program for all of your needs, but I do think once you get there, it's the most powerful program on the market. The other concerns are that it's expensive and that there are high hardware requirements. I mentioned briefly, a lot of people use a remote server to run this program. I think the license for the most part comes with 2 keys, which means you could have it like on a server and on your home computer, or you could have it on a laptop and on a server, whatever. I do think this is nice, but again, it's like it's $1,000 plus piece of software. You definitely want to make sure that you're prepared to spend that kind of money. And in addition to that, you need a good bit of RAM on your machine. I would say generally 32 gigabytes or more of RAM on your machine and a pretty strong processor to make this run smoothly. So for a lot of people, if they want to set up big trees, if they want to run scripts, they just pay for the server, get like 256 gigabytes of RAM on their server, get a really high-end processor, maybe pay $200 to $300 a month for that server, but let sims run around the clock. So my main recommendation there to make that worthwhile is to do all the setup first, do all the setup on your home computer, make sure you're ready to go, save a whole bunch of script files. The setup that I was showing you, you can save those files in advance, then rent your server, load everything on there, and just get it going right away. And if you have everything set up in advance, I suspect you can get a lot of scripts done just in 1 month, maybe in 2 months, and then you could cancel your server and you're done paying for it. But still, it's worth mentioning, this is a lot of planning, it's a lot of setup, it's a lot of money to invest into this program. So the common ways in which I don't want to say concerned, but the ways that I see a lot of players using PioSolver or using these types of programs poorly are listed here. Most of it, I'm going to focus briefly on the microanalysis rabbit hole because this is going to carry over into all of your simulation study. If you're relatively new to the solver world, if learning from solutions or learning from these outputs has been difficult for you, I think this is a really, really important one to talk about. And it's going to be easier if I show you. So here's just an example of a 3-bet pot simulation. I ran this for a heads-up script a little while ago. And the first thing you'll notice, this is just the C betting strategy for the out-of-position player. So I've offered 4 different bet sizes on the flop, as well as a check. There's not a clear strategy here. There's mixing. 3 of the 4 bet sizes, I would say, are being used at a reasonable frequency. And when loading this simulation, you might be inclined to figure out what is going on here, right? What's the full game plan that I'm supposed to be trying to do on this flop? And this is where I think a lot of my students or a lot of players get hung up. They're trying to interpret exactly what's happening here, and they're looking at too many of the details, in my opinion. They're looking at, okay, there's a 2/3 pot bet and a 1/3 pot bet, both being used pretty often. And a lot of hands are mixing this. Let's maybe look for the hands that aren't mixing to see which hands like the 2/3 pot. A lot of people say it this way. I don't love speaking about it this way, but I'm trying to replicate the pitfall here. So 2/3 pot seems to be liked by 3 of a kind. Big hand, big bet, perhaps. It's also pretty frequently used by ace king, ace queen, it appears, right? So maybe really strong high cards, getting a lot of protection, getting some value. Great. It's not quite as well liked by other bluffs, but they're all mixing it in. It's all reasonable, except for some reason, king queen, except for ace 5 and ace 3. Well, maybe those hands have a little bit too much equity. Maybe they're not folding out enough of the stronger hands to make it a good bluff for that size. That all seems reasonable. And with that logic, maybe we would see the smaller bet size starting to get used as we go down in high card strength. I see ace 10 and ace jack are using a lot of the 1/3 size. I see jack 8 offsuit, queen 9 offsuit, these true bluffs. They're using a lot of the 1/3 size. But as I keep looking closer, now I see, okay, well, this equity hand, 5-3 suited, 6-3 suited, they're using a lot of the small size too. And that's not low. So I'm not quite sure what to make of that. And hands like 8-7 and 9-8 are also using the bigger size pretty frequently, which is confusing because I thought that, trips and protection high cards and stronger equity hands were the ones that were using those bets predominantly, but this is about as little equity as you can find. So now I've spent like 2 or 3 minutes already. I'm just going to stop the discussion there. I spent 2 or 3 minutes already trying to sort out the logic behind a split between 2/3 and 1/3. And I've analyzed a lot of different combinations, and I've come to pretty much no conclusions. And I didn't even get into suits. I could start talking about diamonds and clubs compared to spades and hearts. I could start looking at which heart combinations are choosing which size. And then I could look at which diamond combinations are looking at which size. And after about an hour of analysis on this one flop, I'm going to learn basically nothing useful in terms of how to play this spot better. I'm pretty much just spending time pattern seeking and trying to make sense of all the minutia of this output. But that's not going to make your game better. It's maybe going to make you better at interpreting sims, but it's not going to help you play this spot. So I think we really need to take a step back before we enter into the detail of these sims and think, why did I come here? What is the low-hanging fruit that I can take away from these solutions? And what are the big helpful heuristics, like the big outside of just this one board, this one flop? What can I learn from the information that I'm presented with here? So I think, again, coming in with the question before you start analyzing is gonna help limit the amount of time that you spend down this rabbit hole that I'm describing. And yeah, I mean, if you're at the level where the thing you need to figure out is what the different diamond combinations are doing on a spade heart heart or a spade spade heart board, I mean, that's great. You're at a pretty high level of sim analysis if that's the most useful thing for you. But I have a feeling if you go through my evaluation and you go through an analysis of where you're struggling, you're going to find some far more beginner concepts that are far more valuable to you right now than figuring out how 2 diamonds are supposed to play in a 3-bet pot on heart, spade, spade. So overall, just really encouraging those of you who are watching now to come into POSolver with simple questions and take big picture approaches to find simple answers. The rest of my concerns here, I'm going to talk about 2 of them together really quickly. Solver approved and cherry picking outputs. So solver approved, I wrote because this is what happens when players take a line check approach. They played a hand, they're not so happy about it. They want the solver to tell them, yeah, it's okay. You played your hand fine. Or they want the solver to tell them, no, that was a punt. You really shouldn't have done that. And very often it's not obvious when we take a single hand, run it through the solver, and try and figure out if we punted or if it was okay. So I think that it's important to recognize that what you're coming to the solver with that kind of approach is a bit of like you're aiming for conflict resolution. Like you have this nagging feeling that something went wrong and you just want someone to tell you whether it was okay or not. And unfortunately, the solver is not a person. So very often it's just going to tell you what you want it to tell you. And that's where the cherry picking outputs comes into play. Depending on how you use POSolver, you can probably get the answer you want out of it. And then this is true with all data. And I could talk for a long time about the problems with using data that already exists to answer questions that you're bringing to it, anew. But the point is, if you want to know if your river call was good, you could put in the right parameters to POSolver to make your river call good. You could node lock, you could adjust preflop ranges, you could adjust bet sizing, whatever it is that you need to do, you could make it happen. Very often, running a hand and finding out if like a river bluff or a river call or whatever is solver approved is not going to give you helpful information. So if that's the type of question you're asking, I think make sure you're asking it to the right program or to the right person. I mean, I think these are better questions for Discord groups like we have for members of this course. I think it's better for your study partner, for your coach. And I think it's also better to just move away from that type of thinking in poker analysis where you have this urge to figure out if that one decision you made was good or bad. I'm a really big proponent, as you can maybe tell already, of stepping back to macro analysis and thinking, do I understand the necessary things to understand in this situation in general, rather than trying to figure out if you made the right play that one time. Now, flawed parameters are something I'm probably going to get to more in a future video. I'm going to spend some extra time specifically with aggregate reports, where I'm going to talk a lot about parameters. But generally, there's just certain ways where you could set up POSolver or any solver that's customizable that will leave it exposed in one way or another to a certain strategy. What I mean is, if you don't tell it what size to raise the turn, it won't raise the turn. If you leave that line blank, it's not allowed to take that option. So a lot of times I see people setting up really basic parameters or really complicated parameters, but parameters that in some way are missing an option or have led the solver to take a certain path, and they don't recognize it. So it's really important when setting up your sims, especially when setting up scripts that are going to influence a lot of sims, to have someone double check it, to get another set of eyes on it, to look at it once or twice, to come back to it, and make sure that your parameters are sound and not creating the outputs that you're seeing. So this is going to be the summary. Best practices that I feel have worked for me when using POSolver. Macro analysis, as I've said, focus on the big picture, use the power of scripting in this program. I will point out, I do think you need higher than a basic license to make use of scripting, but the pro license or the edge license has these capabilities. This is how you're going to unlock the most powerful parts of the program, is getting reports, as I'll show in a future video, from big scripts, lots of flops, lots of turns, lots of rivers. The iterative testing of parameters is something I'll continue to talk about through this course. It's always like I've been using the program since 2015, and I still tweak my parameters over time to make sure that the right raise sizes, the right bet sizes, the right counters are all being offered. And if you are not critically thinking about the inputs, then you're not going to get well-designed outputs. I don't mean this as like a way to avoid starting using POSolver. I just mean that you should expect that there's going to be some problems with the inputs, and you're going to have to continue to test which bet sizes are working for you, which raise sizes are working for you. and be willing to throw out old sims and replace them with new sims over time. I didn't talk too much about node locking, but this is a really powerful feature in all the solvers that I've used, and PO Solver is no exception. I think knowing intuitively how to exploit has helped me use this feature less personally, because a lot of heads up play has made exploitative play a little more natural for me. But if exploitative play is not natural to you, then node locking shows you what that looks like. It'll show you how to take advantage of whatever leak it is that your opponents have. And I think that spending some time analyzing adjustments are just a huge part of GTO study. And I'll talk more in other videos about how GTO and exploit are basically the same thing. The last thing here is to save everything. I talked about the potential weakness of how much time it takes to set up a sim from scratch. If you save your preflop ranges, if you save your parameters, if you save all your old sims in an organized way, your life is going to be so much easier using programs like this. And you're actually going to enjoy the process of running sims, because you'll be able to load old parameters and tweak and find new answers in seconds rather than hours, right? So that's the goal, is to gradually get more and more out of this program, and it does take a little bit of startup time. But once you've saved everything and organized it, it's for sure the most powerful tool you can have.